What the hell are you doing to my son? The words cracked like lightning through the nursery air, followed by the sound of skin against skin. And just like that, everything in Arthur Sullivan's empire began to change. Not with a board meeting, not with a scandal, but with one slap. And the woman who refused to flinch. If this story moves you, don't forget to hit subscribe and follow us for more stories that warm the heart and awaken the soul. Arthur Sullivan had never stepped into the nursery past midnight. That room, painted in soft grays and whites with moon-shaped mobiles hanging from the ceiling, was where nannies operated and sound machines hummed lullabies he never listened to. His son, Bryce, was 2 months old now, born into privilege, wealth, and carefully sterilized air. But tonight, something unsettled him. He had returned early from a silent dinner with investors in Savannah. The food had been exquisite, the wine flawless, but a hollow ache followed him all the way back to the Sullivan estate in Charleston, like an old ghost clinging to his coat. So he wandered the hallways instead of heading to bed, his footsteps silent on mahogany floors. That's when he heard it. A soft hum. Not the lullaby. A woman's voice, singing something achingly familiar. Arthur opened the nursery door without knocking. Inside, lit only by the moonlight slipping through gauzy curtains, a black woman sat on the rocker. She had undone her uniform blouse, and baby Bryce was nestled against her breast, suckling contentedly. For a second, the room went weightless. "Maya!" he barked, but it came out hoarse, confused. The woman, Maya Green, the housemaid, looked up calmly. Her hand gently stroked the infant's back. Her eyes didn't flinch, not even when Arthur stepped forward with fury swelling in his chest. "What the hell are you doing to my son?" he roared. And then, as if his rage needed punctuation, he slapped her. It wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but the sound echoed like a verdict. Maya's head turned from the force, but she did not cry. Her eyes met his again, still calm, still steady, and she said one sentence that would haunt him for months. "I saved your son." Silence wrapped around them. Arthur's hands trembled, not from guilt, but confusion. The baby in her arms had not stirred, still suckling, peaceful. "I heard him choking," she added, softer now, voice gravelly from lack of sleep. "Your night nurse never came. He couldn't breathe. I reacted, that's all." His voice dropped. You fed him. You had milk?" "I was a neonatal nurse," she said. "I lost my own son 3 months ago. My body doesn't know he's gone yet. Bryce. He needed help. I was here." Arthur's face paled. He looked at his son, alive, flushed, safe. "Why didn't you call for someone?" "I did." No one answered. Before he could speak again, another voice entered the room. "Arthur." It was Margaret Sullivan, his mother. Barefoot in a silk robe, hair silver in the dim light. Her presence, always composed, held power even in silence. "I saw the cameras," she said. "Don't fire her." Arthur turned to her, confused. "Mother, she saved Bryce." Her voice was steel. "We can talk about boundaries later. Right now, she stays." Maya stood, gently placed the baby in the bassinet, adjusted her blouse, and walked to the door. But before she left, she turned back. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, voice neither bitter nor submissive. "Don't thank me. But don't ever hit me again." Later that night, Maya stood in the staff quarters, still in her wrinkled uniform, staring at her own reflection. The red mark on her cheek was fading, but her heart beat like it was still in that nursery. She had dreamed of being a nurse since she was 12. Her license had been suspended not for malpractice, but for the grief that had consumed her when her baby, Elijah, died during sleep. She had left the hospital, unable to hold another newborn. Until now. Bryce had cried in the night, and her body, her grieving, milk-filled body, had answered. She didn't expect understanding, but she never expected a slap. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Arthur stared out over the Sullivan Gardens, his jaw clenched with shame, not just for what he had done, but for how fast he had done it. The sight of her feeding his son had triggered something primal, something he didn't understand. Control, fear, guilt, maybe. Not because she was black, not because she was staff, but because deep down he hadn't been there, and she had. Margaret walked in without knocking. "I want her reassigned," Arthur muttered. "No. You want her kept close," she replied. "She's the only person in this house who actually sees your son as a child, not a schedule. You saw what she did. I saw a woman who gave her milk to save a child, not her own. That's rare, Arthur. Don't you dare punish that." She broke protocol. She followed instinct, something you've long forgotten. The next morning, Maya packed her duffel bag. She had made peace with being fired. At least Bryce was alive. That was enough. But before she could leave, a staff runner came to her room. "Miss Green, Mrs. Sullivan asked that you meet her in the breakfast solarium." Confused, Maya entered the light-drenched room where Margaret sat with a teacup and her ever-knowing eyes. "You'll stay," Margaret said, not asked. "I don't think your son—" "My son is grieving a wife he never truly understood. You, on the other hand, you remind me of her. Stay. Not as a maid, as Bryce's infant caregiver. Temporarily." Maya blinked. "Why me?" Margaret smiled. "Because you have milk, and you have something more dangerous. Grace." In the nursery, later, Maya returned. The rocking chair creaked gently under her as she watched Bryce sleep. She did not know that the mobile above his crib had once belonged to another child, a child named Edward, a name no one spoke in this house. A name that would, before long, shake the walls of this estate and uncover secrets buried in generations of silence. But for now, she held only one truth. She had saved a child. And it had saved her back. Morning broke over Charleston with a golden light that touched everything, except the shadows in Arthur Sullivan's mind. He sat at the head of the breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling beside his tablet. His son, Bryce, was asleep in the nursery upstairs, and the house was too quiet for a mansion of this size. Across from him, Margaret Sullivan flipped the page of her newspaper with slow precision, as if the rustle itself were part of the discipline she lived by. "She's packing," Arthur said without looking up. Margaret didn't raise her head. "And you're letting her?" She crossed a line. "She saved your son." Arthur looked out the window, jaw tight. "I don't want this to become a headline, Mother. We're a Sullivan. This house, this family, it runs on structure, not sentiment." Margaret folded the paper and finally looked at her son. "It used to run on silence. And look where that's gotten us." In the staff hallway, Maya folded the last of her clothes into a worn canvas duffel. She didn't cry. She had promised herself ever since Elijah died that no one would ever see her cry again. But her hands shook when she folded the tiny infant onesie, the one Bryce had outgrown after 3 weeks. She had washed it herself, ironed it. She'd even caught herself smiling while doing so. That was the dangerous part. She was starting to care. A knock at the door. She opened it to find Margaret, standing with a look that belonged more to a judge than a mother. "You're not leaving," Margaret said. With all due respect, ma'am. I said you're not leaving, the older woman repeated, slower this time. You'll stay. Temporarily. As Bryce's caregiver. Not maid, not staff. Infant caregiver. Maya blinked. Why me? Because you've already proven you can do what no one else in this house did. You listened. You showed up. And you fed him when he was blue in the face. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Margaret replied. It's redemption. For all of us. Days later, a new role. Maya's job shifted, quietly. Her apron was replaced with soft cardigans. The cleaning staff stopped giving her orders. Instead, she was now the one writing down Bryce's feeding logs, ordering hypoallergenic formula, researching infant massages. She didn't sleep in the servant wing anymore. Margaret had moved her to a guest bedroom near the nursery. There was a window view of the Sullivan Gardens, where Spanish moss swayed in the humid air like secrets on strings. Arthur, meanwhile, avoided her entirely. They hadn't spoken since the slap. He walked around her like she was made of glass or dynamite. But Bryce reached for her, gurgled when he heard her voice, slept deeper in her arms than in his expensive bassinet. And that was enough, for now. One rainy afternoon, while organizing the nursery closet, Maya came across a wooden rattle carved by hand. It was tucked behind a box of unused baby monitors. The rattle was older, polished from years of use. On its side was a small engraving, EM. She froze. This wasn't a baby item that came from any luxury catalog. It was intimate, homemade. The letters were engraved in the kind of delicate script one might carve for love, not display. EM? She whispered aloud. Bryce cooed from his crib. Maya turned the rattle in her hand, the wood warm against her skin. Something about the weight of it, emotional, not physical, made her feel like she was holding a memory that didn't belong to her. That night, Maya knocked gently on Margaret's study door. Yes, came the reply. I found something, Maya said, stepping in. In the nursery. She handed her the rattle. Margaret's hand hovered over it for a beat too long before taking it. Margaret looked down at it. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes did. They flickered. Pain, guilt, recognition. You don't have to explain, Maya said softly, but Margaret shook her head. You deserve an explanation. Soon, but not yet. And then, with more warmth than Maya expected, she added, Keep it. Bryce likes the sound. And maybe it's time someone remembered what that name stood for. In her room that night, Maya stared at the rattle on her nightstand. EM. Who was this child? Where had he gone? And why did a family with so many nannies, nurses, and night shifts still carry a shadow heavy enough to silence even the matriarch? Whatever the answer was, it wasn't buried in dust. It was buried in grief. And Maya Green had never been afraid of grief. It was supposed to be just a rattle, just a carved wooden toy forgotten in the back of a nursery shelf. But in Maya's hands, it became a question, and questions in the Sullivan house were dangerous things. A week later, Charleston Historical Society. The brass handles of the Charleston Historical Society were cold when Maya pushed the door open. Rain slicked her sleeves, but she'd walked the entire way, needed the time to think, to doubt, and still show up anyway. Inside, rows of oak filing cabinets stood like old men keeping secrets. The scent of mildew, paper, and old pine filled the air. There was no one in sight except a thin, spectacled archivist behind the counter. His name tag read Peter. "Can I help you?" he asked, peering over his glasses. "I'm researching a name," Maya said, cautious. "It's from the Sullivan family. Charleston locals. High profile. Peter tilted his head. That family's had a long legacy around here. What's the name? Maya hesitated. Then, quietly, Edward Moore. Searching the name, Peter typed into the digital catalog. The screen blinked, processed. No Edward Moore listed as part of the Sullivan lineage, he said. At least not publicly. Try 1975 to 1980, Maya said. Anything. Birth announcements, obituaries, baptism records. Peter tapped again. A beat later, he frowned. Wait. There's one record. He turned the monitor toward her. It was a newspaper clipping, scanned from the archives of the Charleston Observer, dated June 14th, 1978. Child drowns at Sullivan Estate. No memorial service held. The photo was grainy, the headline subdued, almost buried on the page. The article only ran 3 paragraphs. It mentioned the name of the estate, the presence of family members at the scene, and an accidental death involving a male child. The name? Edward Moore Sullivan. Age, 3 years and 7 months. Cause of death, presumed drowning. Disposition, private family matters. No obituary published. Maya stared at the screen, her stomach sinking. There had been a child. He had existed. He had died. And then he was erased. Back at the estate. That evening, Maya returned soaked to the bone. But she didn't care. She went straight to her room, dried herself, and stared at the photo she had discreetly printed from the archive. A grainy image of the estate's lake, cordoned off with yellow tape. No picture of the boy. No funeral. No mention of Clare. She tucked the page into her notebook and added one line. Edward Moore Sullivan. Why no memorial? The library, after midnight. Unable to sleep, Maya tiptoed through the grand hall and found herself drawn to the Sullivan family library. It was a towering room, dark leather armchairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, portraits of past patriarchs whose eyes seemed to follow you. One in particular bore a striking resemblance to Arthur. George Sullivan, Arthur's father. Maya lit a lamp and began scanning through books, journals, anything personal. She didn't know what she was looking for until her fingers brushed a thin, leather-bound ledger tucked behind volumes on South Carolina maritime law. She opened it and froze. Inside were handwritten schedules from the late 1970s, appointments, meetings, dinners, but near the back were pages labeled simply C.M., Clare Moore. And there, in Clare's careful cursive, was a line that stopped Maya's breath. Edward sang to the trees again today. Says the birds know secrets. Margaret says not to encourage it. But I see light in him. Arthur never even looks. A surprise encounter. The door creaked open behind her. Maya jumped. It was Arthur. He stood in the doorway in his navy robe, hair disheveled, eyes tired. You're in here late, he said. I couldn't sleep. Arthur stepped closer. His gaze flicked to the open ledger in her lap. That belonged to my mother. I know. Silence stretched. Did you know him? Maya asked. Edward? Arthur blinked. Something shifted behind his eyes, but he didn't answer. Then he said, There was no Edward. I saw the newspaper, Arthur. He clenched his jaw. Whatever you think you found, let it go. But he was your brother. Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper. I never had a brother. And he turned and left. In the quiet that followed, Maya closed the ledger slowly. The words were still with her. Edward sang to the trees again today. There had been a child, Not just erased, but unspoken. A boy too alive, too sensitive, too inconvenient for the kind of legacy the Sullivans were building. Maya folded the newspaper clipping and placed it next to the wooden rattle. 2 artifacts, 2 proofs, and a truth that was no longer sleeping. Some secrets disappear because no one remembers. Others vanish because someone intended to forget. But the worst secrets, the ones that burn through generations, are those hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one person brave enough to read between the silences. Maya Green was that person now, and she was about to step into a silence Clare Sullivan had once tried to shatter. The room at the end of the hall. It was Margaret who directed her there. After another quiet breakfast where Arthur refused to meet Maya's gaze, Margaret walked her through the west wing of the house, a part rarely used. At the very end stood a wooden door with a tarnished brass knob. She opened it with a small iron key. "This was Clare's sanctuary," Margaret said softly. It was a study of sorts, filled with old medical textbooks, herbal charts, and a rocking chair by the window that faced the lake. The walls were lined with journals, each neatly labeled with years, 1996 to 2015. "I thought she was a volunteer," Maya said. "She was," Margaret nodded. "But not just for bake sales and Sunday schools. Clare volunteered in postnatal clinics. She sat with women no one else wanted to sit with, especially those accused of unfit motherhood." Maya's fingers brushed one of the journals. "Why did no one talk about this?" "Because Arthur's father didn't approve," Margaret said. "And Arthur never asked." Margaret placed the iron key in Maya's hand. "She left this room to me. But I think she meant it for you." The Journals of Clare Sullivan. Maya spent the next 3 days reading. In those worn pages, Clare came alive, not as a trophy wife or a shadow behind a tech empire, but as a woman of startling compassion, anger, and intellect. One entry read, "Sometimes I feel more at home in clinics than I do in my own house. I meet mothers who have no names in the system, who lost their children not because they were unfit, but because they were poor or grieving or just didn't have the right kind of quiet." And then another. "There was a young woman today, Maya Green. I was supposed to interview her for a care rotation. She didn't show. Later I found out her baby was sick. I didn't reschedule, I should have. There was something in her file, resilience." Maya gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Clare had written about her. All those years ago, before Maya ever set foot in this house, Clare had seen her name. Had seen her. A piece of thread in a locked box. Behind the rocking chair was a small oak trunk. Maya pried it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Some addressed to Arthur, others to Clare's sister in Philadelphia. All unsent. One envelope was addressed simply, "To the one who listens." Inside was a letter written in Clare's fluid, almost musical handwriting. "I worry about Edward still. I saw something in him, something vibrant and raw that this house could not contain. George wanted it silenced. Arthur learned to look away, but I never did. And now, Bryce grows, and I fear the silence will grow with him, unless someone brave enough walks into the room and dares to ask what happened here, and why no one ever screamed." Maya's hands trembled. She looked up and saw herself in the dusty mirror across the room. Not a maid, not a temporary caregiver, but a woman holding the voice of another woman who had tried to warn the world and failed. Later that night, the hallway encounter. Maya caught Arthur just as he was leaving the library. She held out the letter. "I found this. Claire wrote about Edward. She wrote about me." Arthur didn't take the letter. "I don't want to know." "She believed in you," Maya said, "even if you didn't believe in yourself." "I was a child." "She wasn't." Arthur's hand clenched. "You think she was a saint? She lost herself at the end. She—" "No," Maya interrupted. "She lost her voice. There's a difference." He stared at her, breathing hard, silent, wounded. And then he left her standing in the hallway alone. The nightmare. That night, Maya dreamed of a child singing to the trees. His voice echoed in a language no one remembered, and every time he called out, the wind swallowed his name. She woke up crying, for a boy she never met, and for a woman who once tried to save him, through letters never sent, and faith never returned. Some ghosts haunt halls. Others live in records, faded photographs, or the spaces between two names in a family tree. But the most terrifying ghosts, the ones no one dares speak of, are the ones still breathing. And one of them was named Edward Sullivan, or Eli Garrett, as he was now known. The detectives report. Maya didn't tell Arthur she was hiring someone. She knew he wouldn't approve. But after everything she'd read in Clare's letters, after tracing the name Edward Sullivan through newspaper clippings and medical licensing boards, she knew she needed help. She contacted Reuben Hale, a retired NYPD detective now specializing in lost persons investigations. He had a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. They met in a cafe off King Street. Reuben was a quiet man, wiry, mid-60s, with a gaze that measured everyone in seconds and a voice like worn gravel. "What makes you think he's alive?" he asked. Because Clare wrote to him like he was still out there. She didn't mourn him. She searched for him. And someone buried the truth. Reuben nodded once. "Give me 3 days." 3 days later, a name returns. The email arrived at 6:14 a.m. Subject, possible location, Edward Sullivan. Body, alias Eli Garrett. Age, 48. Current residence, Meadowvale Recovery Center, Albany, NY. Admitted under court-directed guardianship in 1992. Diagnosis, schizoaffective disorder, questionable. No legal visitors for the past 10 years. No recorded next of kin. Maya read it twice. Then she printed it, folded it into her pocket, and knocked on Arthur's office door. The confrontation. Arthur looked up from his desk, clearly annoyed. "You need something?" "Yes," Maya said. "A road trip." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "To Albany. To a facility called Meadowvale. Your brother is alive." The room went still. Arthur slowly stood. "No. He drowned." "No, he didn't. He was institutionalized, illegally, and he's been there for over 30 years. Arthur's knuckles whitened on the edge of his desk. "You don't understand." "Then come and make me understand." He stared at her, jaw locked, breath unsteady. Then he whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "My father told me. There was nothing left to bury." "Your father lied." The drive north. They didn't speak much on the way. The car sped through Carolina Pines, into Virginia, and up through the winding back roads of New York State. It wasn't until they passed the sign for Albany County that Arthur finally broke the silence. "I remember him, you know," he said quietly. "Edward. He was strange. Sweet, but different." "Different how?" He used to hum to himself in the garden. Said the wind talked back. My father hated it. Said he embarrassed the family. He called him a liability. Maya didn't reply. Arthur added, "One day he was gone. They said he drowned. There was no funeral. I never saw a body." Now his voice cracked. "And I never asked." Meadowvale Recovery Center. The facility sat at the edge of a forest, red brick, surrounded by fog. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic and old wood. A nurse greeted them with suspicion until Maya presented her credentials and a court-signed visitor request Reuben had helped secure. The nurse led them through quiet halls, past faded murals of birds and trees, to a small common room with only one patient inside. A man sat near the window, rocking gently in a chair. Thin, graying. Eyes that saw far beyond the glass. "Eli!" the nurse called. He turned slowly, and Arthur gasped. "Edward," he whispered. The man blinked. His gaze wandered, then settled. A long silence. Then, in a voice soft and deliberate, "Artie?" Arthur sank into the nearest chair. And for a moment, the fog lifted. The conversation that never happened. Edward, Eli, was slow to speak, but his words were lucid, measured. He remembered Clare. "She used to sneak me books, called me her moon child." He remembered Arthur. "You were always afraid to look." He remembered Margaret. She stayed silent to survive. And he remembered George Sullivan. "He brought the doctor, the one who signed the papers, told me I was a problem he was solving." Arthur whispered, "They said you drowned." Edward smiled sadly. "I did, just not in water." The truth on paper. Maya requested a release of medical records. It confirmed what they feared. Edward had been declared mentally unfit and placed under a long-term guardianship with no external oversight. The diagnosis, schizoaffective disorder, was never independently verified. The court psychologist had been a personal friend of George Sullivan. A case of involuntary commitment hidden under wealth and influence. A child locked away to protect a legacy. Arthur sat in the visitor's lounge, unread documents in his lap. "I was 9, he whispered. "I didn't know how to fight for him." Maya placed her hand on his. "You do now." On the drive back. Arthur didn't cry, but he did say one thing before they reached the Charleston city line. "I want him home." And for the first time in decades, the Sullivan family would no longer be missing a name. The attic had always been locked. For decades, it sat above the Sullivan estate like an unused lung, full of air but never allowed to breathe. Dust had sealed its corners. Sunlight dared not enter, and the one key that could open it hadn't been used since Clare Sullivan was buried. Until now. A return in silence. Edward came home without ceremony. Margaret greeted him at the door with a hand on his shoulder and no words. Arthur stood nearby, unsure whether to hug or apologize, so he said nothing at all. And Maya simply smiled. Bryce, too young to understand the weight of a man's return after decades of erasure, reached for Edward from Maya's arms. Edward didn't touch him. He just looked and whispered, still light in the eyes, just like hers. That evening, as Margaret settled Edward into the guest wing, she handed Maya a ring of old brass keys. "The attic," she said. "It's time." The unlocking. The key turned with resistance, as if the door itself had forgotten how to open. The attic was cold, despite the southern heat. Dust motes danced in shafts of light from the small, circular window. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, some labeled in Clare's elegant cursive, others bore no markings at all. Maya lit a small lamp and began to dig. The discovery. 2 hours in, behind a trunk of baby clothes and wedding china, she found a wooden crate marked with a fading ink stamp. Clare. Do not destroy. Inside were over 40 letters bound together with a silk ribbon, each one addressed to a different recipient: judges, journalists, old college friends. None had been sent, and every envelope bore the same salutation: I write because silence has cost too much. Maya read one, then another, and then couldn't stop. The contents of truth. In the letters, Clare detailed the years after Edward's disappearance. She spoke of medical ethics violated, guardianships forged, and psychiatric diagnoses pushed without consent. She described her husband, George, as a man more concerned with legacy than life. In one letter, Clare wrote, Edward didn't scare me. He scared George, because Edward didn't perform. He felt too deeply, sang to winds, named trees. He wasn't broken. He was just unpolished. Another letter was addressed to a Dr. Yvonne Delacroix at Yale's School of Nursing. You once told me truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. But I think, in this house, it does. Please, listen for me, if I'm ever gone. Maya's chest ached. Clare had tried. Clare had shouted. But the world had covered its ears. Grace Hollins. There was one box left. Inside it, buried beneath Clare's old nursing pins and faded volunteer name tags, was a sealed envelope with a familiar name. Grace Hollins, 2003. Maya's breath caught. Grace was the former housemaid, now retired in North Charleston. She had served the Sullivan family for nearly 40 years, through Clare's marriage, Edward's disappearance, and George's reign over silence. The letter was unopened. The visit. The next day, Maya and Arthur drove to Grace's home, a modest bungalow with peeling shutters and hydrangeas growing wild along the fence. Grace, now in her 70s, answered the door in a faded floral dress. Her eyes widened when she saw Arthur. You look like your mother, she whispered. When Maya handed her the letter, Grace stared at it for a long time. Then she sat on the porch swing and opened it with shaking hands. Tears streamed down her face as she read. I knew she was writing, Grace said, voice fragile. I was told to destroy them. By who? Arthur asked. Your father, she replied without hesitation. He said, if anyone ever found those letters, it would ruin everything. I wanted to keep my job. I wanted to keep my home. Maya placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. But you didn't destroy this one. No, Grace whispered, because Clare said she would leave me a sign. And she did. She told me she hid a list. A record. A record of what? Grace looked up. A list of every mother she believed had been falsely institutionalized. She kept names, files, dates. She wanted the truth to outlive her. Where is it now? Maya asked. In a room no one dared open, Grace said. You'll find it where she screamed. The return to the house. Maya and Arthur returned to the attic and opened the last trunk, tucked beneath the eaves. Inside was a thin leather folio marked, "In case I don't get to testify." Inside were names, dozens, dates, case numbers, state facilities, notes in Clare's hand. She had documented a system of forced psychiatric commitments, mostly women, mostly poor, often single, who had been declared unfit and quietly institutionalized under the guise of protecting children or reputations. It wasn't just about Edward. It was about hundreds of Edwards. The storm gathering. Arthur sat on the attic floor, folder in hand, his hands visibly shaking. "She kept this for decades," he whispered. "She tried to save them all," Maya said, "and now we have to finish what she started." Arthur looked at Maya, not as a caregiver, not as an employee, but as a woman who had just reawakened his family's soul. And he nodded. "Let's burn it all down, every lie." Truth rarely walks through the front door. It climbs in through broken windows, hides in forgotten wings, and sometimes, just sometimes, it waits in locked rooms where screams were never heard. And now, Maya and Arthur were ready to open one. The plan. They knew the risk. Arthur's father, George Sullivan, had long since passed, but his influence, legal, financial, and reputational, lingered like smoke in the halls of power. Many of the names in Clare's secret folio pointed to a state-run psychiatric institution in New York, St. Augustine Recovery and Custodial Center. It had long been closed, records sealed, but whispers said some of those records had been absorbed by the St. Augustine State Archives, a vast subterranean facility in New York City where old court files, medical transcripts, and sealed commitments were stored, mostly ignored by the public. And like most things hidden, it wasn't on the public map. "I know someone," Arthur said, "an old college roommate, works for the State Judiciary Archive System. If he gives us access, we go in, quietly, no press, no noise." "And if he says no?" Maya asked. Arthur looked at her, eyes steel. "Then we make noise." The arrival. St. Augustine Archives did not look like a place where lives had been rewritten. It looked like a governmental afterthought, gray cement walls, flickering fluorescent lights, a receptionist who barely looked up. But beneath the main floor was a restricted access wing marked Archived Medical Cases. Sealed under Section 14.7, Arthur's contact, James Linwood, a thin man with guilt in his eyes, greeted them in the hallway. He handed them badges without a word. "You have 2 hours," he muttered. "I was never here." The elevator buzzed open. The locked wing waited. The descent. The underground vault was cold. File cabinets ran in endless rows. The lights buzzed low. Somewhere deep, a dehumidifier rattled. And near the back, behind a rusted grate, was a row of files marked 1975 to 1985, non-compliant cases. They opened the drawer. And there it was. Moore, Edward Sullivan. Admission, October 12, 1980. Custodian of record, Dr. Thomas Avery II. Arthur whispered, "That's his grandfather. The current Dr. Avery is his son." Maya pulled the file. Inside, a consent form signed not by Clare, but by George Sullivan, bypassing maternal objection by invoking emergency guardianship. The doctor who filed the psychiatric report had later been disciplined for ethics violations, but the case had vanished. Also included was a handwritten complaint. Patient displays non-normative behaviors, excessive empathy, non-verbal communication with animals, insistence on silence, unpredictable attachment to nature. Father reports child speaks of hearing voices from trees. Maya stared at it. "That's not a diagnosis," she said. "That's poetry." Arthur's voice was flat. That's fear. My father feared what he didn't understand. And so, he locked it away. The nurse who remembered among the file notes was a name Maya had seen once before in Clare's journals. Elaine Thatcher, RN attending nurse, St. Augustine Center. Maya gasped. She kept a journal. They searched. Drawer after drawer. Finally, tucked in a worn, leather-bound folder marked Personnel Personal Statements, they found it. A battered, water-stained journal with E.T. scribbled on the cover. Elaine had written everything. Clare Sullivan visited once. She wasn't allowed beyond the glass. They told her Edward was unstable, but he sat calmly, humming. She cried when they pulled her away. I heard her scream through the walls. I tried to speak up once. My letter disappeared. They moved me to records. They're drugging him heavily. No consent, just protocol. No one sees, no one hears, no one screams. Maya pressed her fingers to the page. Now someone does. The confrontation. As they ascended back to ground level, a man stood waiting outside the elevator. Tall, confident, dressed in navy blue with a nameplate that read, Dr. Thomas Avery III. Arthur froze. The doctor's voice was smooth, too smooth. I'm going to need you to return what you've taken. Maya held the journal close to her chest. It's public record, she said. No, he replied. It's sealed under judicial protection. Misuse of medical files is a federal offense. Arthur stepped forward. I'm a Sullivan, he said. This was done to my family. I have every right to uncover it. Dr. Avery smiled without warmth. Your name might open doors, Mr. Sullivan, but it won't protect you from opening the wrong ones. He leaned closer to Maya. Be careful, Ms. Green. I know people, and I assure you, this won't end the way you think. He turned and walked away. Arthur looked at Maya. What now? She held up the journal. Now, we make it end the way Clare wanted. The decision. That night, Maya and Arthur sat at the dining table, surrounded by files. Edward slept upstairs, no longer a ghost in his own home. Bryce lay curled in Maya's arms, unaware of the war being waged to preserve the world he would grow up in. Arthur finally looked at Maya and said, We go public. Letters, journal, all of it. And the consequences? Arthur's voice was steady. Let them come. Maya nodded, and in that moment, the locked wing of silence was gone. It started not with a scream, but with a whisper. A quiet voice that had waited for decades in old paper, behind sealed doors, beneath the dust of silence. And now, that whisper was about to echo across the country. The call to Camille Price. Maya dialed the number with trembling fingers. The line clicked. Camille Price, a firm voice answered. Veteran investigative journalist, Pulitzer finalist, a name Clare Sullivan had written 3 times in her unsent letters. Ms. Price, my name is Maya Green, she began. I'm calling from Charleston. I think I have a story that belongs to you. A pause, then, you have 1 minute. I have the sealed psychiatric commitment of Edward Sullivan, son of George Sullivan. I have a journal from Nurse Elaine Thatcher detailing falsified medical records. I have letters, dozens, from Clare Sullivan describing an entire system of forced institutionalization. And I have Arthur Sullivan, Clare's son, willing to go on record. Another pause, this one longer. I'll be on the next flight to Charleston. The interview. Camille arrived the next morning with a cameraman and 3 legal binders. In the sunroom of the Sullivan estate, The camera rolled as Arthur sat across from her, wearing a navy blazer and no tie. Maya sat just off frame, Bryce on her lap, Edward watching from a quiet corner with Margaret beside him. Camille leaned forward. "Why speak now, Mr. Sullivan?" Arthur exhaled. "Because silence has been inherited long enough. My family silenced my brother. My father silenced my mother. And I spent most of my life not asking questions because I was afraid of what the answers might say about me. But Maya Green isn't afraid. And neither was Claire. So I won't be either." He looked at the camera. "My name is Arthur Sullivan. My brother was stolen by a lie. And we are not the only ones." The publication. 1 week later, the front page of the Baltimore Sun read, "The Sullivan Silence. Inside America's Hidden History of Involuntary Commitment" by Camille Price. The piece blew open decades of rot. It named the doctors, the forged guardianships, the judicial loopholes that allowed hundreds, maybe thousands, of women and children to disappear into mental institutions without trial or defense. The center photo was of Clare Sullivan, smiling on a volunteer day in Philadelphia, a little boy beside her with gentle eyes. Edward. And beneath the image, a caption that read, "They said he drowned, but he was just quiet in a world too loud to hear him." The fallout. Media vans lined the wrought iron gates of the Sullivan estate. Calls flooded the family foundation. But something else happened Maya didn't expect. Letters arrived. Hundreds. From Ohio, Arkansas, Queens, San Diego, Mobile. Women who had lost sisters, mothers, sons, declared unfit and never seen again. One envelope held only a photograph and a note. She was institutionalized in 1991 for emotional excess. She just loved too hard. Thank you for naming it. Another came from a school janitor in St. Louis. "My brother used to sing to trees, too. They took him when he was 10. We thought we were alone. We're not." The foundation. That spring, Maya and Arthur officially launched the Clare Sullivan Memorial Foundation for Restorative Justice and Mental Health Reform. The foundation's mission: reopen sealed psychiatric cases. Support legal advocacy for families of the wrongly institutionalized. Archive testimonies in partnership with the Library of Congress. Build a public museum in Charleston on Sullivan land. Edward stood beside Maya at the launch. He said only 3 words before stepping down from the podium. "Someone heard me." The moment of return. One day, a young woman knocked on the estate's gate, holding the hand of a thin, older woman with faded eyes and a twitch in her fingers. "I saw the story," she told Maya. "My mom was institutionalized when I was 5. I got her out last year, but no one ever believed us, until now." She handed Maya a folder. Inside was a yellowed medical file. Another whisper. Another life. Maya looked up, voice breaking. "We'll help." In the quiet of night. That evening, Maya sat in the nursery, Bryce asleep on her chest. She looked at the old wooden rattle still engraved with EM, now polished clean and placed on a velvet cushion near Bryce's crib. Edward stepped in. "I thought about burning it once," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" He smiled, slow and tired. "Because even when they tried to erase me, that rattle was still here." Maya nodded. "Claire made sure it survived." Edward looked at her. "So did you. Every house has a room that remembers, even when the people forget. Even when the files are burned, the keys misplaced, the furniture replaced, there's always a space that holds on to truth. And in the Sullivan estate, that space was beneath the floorboards. The envelope without a return address. It arrived without warning. No name, no stamp. Just a plain manila envelope slipped under the heavy gate of the Sullivan home. Maya opened it slowly. Inside, a faded photograph of Clare, face distorted in grief, pressed against a window pane. And scribbled on the back, "Come to where she first screamed." Arthur recognized the photo immediately. "That's from the East Wing, the old cellar window." Margaret's voice trembled. "No one's gone down there since George died. It was sealed after Clare's episode." Edward, watching silently, whispered, "She didn't have an episode. She had a moment of clarity." The cellar door. Maya and Arthur found the door beneath a carpet runner in the far east hallway. The lock was rusted, the hinges stiff. Arthur used a crowbar. The smell hit them first. Dust, mildew, and old grief. Flashlights swept over stone walls, cracked tile, and discarded furniture. At the far end of the cellar stood a soundproof door, its surface padded in leather, its frame reinforced with steel. No one said a word. Maya pressed her ear to it. Silence. She turned the knob. It opened with a sigh. The room. The chamber was small, barely larger than a hospital room. Pale blue walls, peeling. A metal bed frame bolted to the floor. Restraint loops still intact. And carved faintly into the wall, almost erased by time. "I am still here." Arthur stood frozen. "This is where they brought her," Margaret whispered, "after she refused to sign the papers about Edward. Your father called it containment." "Containment," Arthur said bitterly. "It was a cage." Maya turned slowly, flashlight trembling in her hand. "Clare screamed here, and no one listened." Edward stepped into the room last. He walked to the far corner and sat quietly on the cold floor. "She used to sing lullabies," he murmured. "From this corner, I could hear her through the vents. That's how I knew I wasn't gone." A witness returns. That evening, Maya made a call to someone she never expected to hear back from. Richard Vance, former Sullivan driver now living quietly in Georgia, answered after the third ring. "Maya Green," he said. "I was waiting for this call." He arrived 2 days later, gray-bearded, weathered, and heavy with something he'd carried for too long. They sat in the sunroom with Camille Price recording audio off the record. "I drove Claire to that facility," Richard said. "The day she was locked in that room, she was kicking, screaming. Said she knew the truth. Said George had erased a child and now he was going to erase her too." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "I found this wedged under the seat months later. I never gave it to anyone. I didn't know if I was brave enough." He handed it to Arthur. It was a torn page from Claire's journal. "They will call me broken, but I am simply unwilling to lie. If Edward is a ghost, then so am I. But ghosts knock, and someone will open the door." Maya closed her eyes. She was writing to the future. The renovation. That night, Arthur stood in the cellar again. Then he called in an architect. Within a week, the room was gutted, not destroyed, transformed. The padded cell became a gallery space. The carved words, "I am still here," were preserved behind glass. And a single plaque hung above the entrance, "The room where she screamed. Clare Sullivan, 1969-2017. Silenced. Believed. Remembered." The interview that went viral. Iris Chen, a young reporter from PBS, interviewed Maya on site. "You stood here," she said, "in the room where a woman was locked away for telling the truth. Why open it to the public?" Maya answered without hesitation. Because if we don't preserve the place where she screamed, we'll forget why she had to scream in the first place. The clip aired that night. By morning, over 7 million views. One final whisper. Later that week, Maya found Edward in the garden. He stood under the weeping willow, the same one he used to hum to as a child. "I remember now," he said. She used to press her hand against the floorboards above and say, "If you hear me, sing it back." So I did. He looked at Maya, eyes glassy. She heard me once, and now the world hears her. Truth doesn't just end stories. Sometimes it begins them. Like wildflowers breaking through stone, truth grows in the cracks of silence, slow, stubborn, and radiant. And in Charleston, under Spanish moss and memory, it had finally bloomed. A garden in her name. Spring arrived with a gentler light that year. Where the old north wing of the Sullivan estate once stood, a new space had taken root. The Clare Sullivan Memorial Garden and Archive opened its gates on a rainy Sunday morning. At the center stood a bronze statue, Clare seated on a bench, one hand on her lap, the other holding a journal open to the wind. The plaque beneath read, "To the one who listened." Visitors wandered through rows of wildflowers, each patch named for one of the women Clare had documented. There were no marble walls, no cold stone, just life growing where pain had once lived. Inside the archive building, Maya walked past rows of digitized files, letters, journal entries, medical forms, and paused at the section labeled Recovered Voices. She ran her hand over the spines. Truth, all of it, preserved. The Foundation's first case victory. It came from Louisiana. A single mother wrongly declared unfit after postpartum psychosis. She had been institutionalized for 8 years, her child placed in foster care. With the help of Clare's foundation and a coalition of lawyers and psychiatrists, she was released. Her name was Denise Holloway. On the courthouse steps, with cameras flashing, Denise said, "I didn't think anyone would ever hear me again. And then a woman who died years ago changed my life." The story aired nationally. Applications for post-institutional review tripled overnight. A letter from Yale. One afternoon, Maya received a package postmarked New Haven, Connecticut. Inside, a letter from the Dean of Yale School of Nursing. A framed honorary certificate. A scholarship announcement. The Clare Sullivan Fellowship for Ethical Psychiatric Reform. And then, tucked at the bottom, a handwritten note. Clare Sullivan believed in listening. So do we. We would be honored to partner with your foundation to train future advocates. Maya cried for a long time. Edward's voice. Edward, now legally restored as Edward Moore Sullivan, lived quietly in the cottage behind the estate. He spent mornings in the garden, afternoons writing letters, evenings drawing by candlelight. One evening, Maya found him with Bryce on his lap, teaching him how to hum to the willow trees. When Maya joined them, Edward said, "I've written a children's book." "You have?" He nodded. "It's called The Boy Who Talked to Leaves. It's not just for children." Maya smiled. "I don't think anything true ever is." A visitor from New Orleans. One Friday, a school group arrived from New Orleans to tour the archive. Among them, a girl no older than 10 stood in front of Clare's statue for a long time. Maya noticed her stillness. "Would you like to ask me something?" Maya said gently. The girl nodded. Her voice was soft but certain. "My mom got out last year. She used to talk to air, so they took her. But now she's home, and she said, if I ever see the woman who helped, I should say thank you." Maya knelt, heart full. You just did. Margaret's final gift. That summer, Margaret Sullivan passed quietly in her sleep, a book resting on her chest, Clare's last journal. She left behind no speeches, no fanfare, but her will included one clause: to Maya Green, the deed to the Sullivan East Garden, and this instruction: plant something that will outlive us all. Maya did. A year later, the anniversary. The first annual Clare Day drew crowds from across the country. Survivors, advocates, students, lawmakers, artists. They came with photos, letters, music, grief, and hope. Camille Price gave the keynote. Edward read a poem. Arthur stood beside Maya, no longer hollowed by his family's past, but made whole by how he had chosen to carry it. And Maya? She carried Bryce on her hip, his tiny hand resting on the rattle still marked EM, now passed to him like an heirloom. She looked out at the garden, at the statue, the people, the truth that had survived, the justice that had bloomed, and whispered, more to herself than anyone, "You were right, Clare. Someone listened." Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of this story. This was never just about a forgotten brother, a silenced mother, or a child nearly erased by wealth and legacy. This was the story of a woman who chose to listen, who walked straight into the quiet corridors of power, carrying nothing but her courage and a heart wide enough to hold the truth. We hope that somewhere in the real world, there are more Maya Greens out there. Ordinary people brave enough to ask hard questions, to speak out for those who can't, and to believe that healing is still possible. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more true-hearted stories about the unheard, the unseen, and the hope that grows in the cracks. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.